You may already be familiar with the idea of best practices. If you're not, you're eventually going to come across a web page or an article that has a list of things that purport to be best practices. Or you might read an article where there's just one and they discuss it. I don't have a problem with there being best practices, but I do have a problem with calling them best practices because of the way they're mindlessly implemented without thought in many cases. For instance, someone might have a best practice that really doesn't apply to them, and they spend a lot of time implementing it, perhaps only to cause problems later. I'll give you an instance of that in a moment. Or you might be in an environment where there is an IT manager who doesn't have a SQL Server background, who essentially has the position, I don't know what you DBAs do, I don't want to know, but I want you to implement these best practices, because that way if I can say I as a manager have done that, then I've covered my ass in the case of future problems. I think best practices are very often mindlessly implemented. One of the reasons being that these best practices are very often created in response to problems that only users of perhaps huge databases have, hundreds of megabytes of data in a database. Now, even for enterprises that have databases that large, I can tell you that most of the databases they have deal with subsets, parts of their company where these databases are very important, but where the same considerations may not apply for these databases as for the largest ones. But when best practices are made, very often they are focused on very large databases. Let me give you an example. One of the best practices for SQL Server says that the system tables, the database catalog, the SQL Server tables that keep information about the structure of the SQL Server database itself, this should be in a separate file group. That's a best practice. Now, there are a couple problems with that. One, you may not know what a file group is yet. And two, people come up with the question is, well, if it's such a great best practice, why isn't it the default so that when you create a database, it creates a separate file group for the system tables? That might be a difficult question to answer under some circumstances. But I'm going to tell you a circumstance where I have seen that this is a problem. This best practice is recommended very often because when you have very large databases, there may come a time when you are going to have to restore them to a different configuration of disks than you started out with. Or your primary file group may become full and you don't know how to handle that situation. These ideas may not mean anything to you, but they're a situation that is not as common on smaller departmental databases. Now, suppose you go ahead and know what this means, and you implement it. And you're sick one day, and there's a problem where this database has to be restored. Maybe because there was a failure in the original database. Maybe because someone needs a copy of the database to test some new code that works against it. Now, the problem with having this file group is if the person that supports you, or you yourself, are not familiar with the concepts of file groups and why they're such a good idea, you may have trouble restoring the database at all. For those of you who do this every day, you're going to say that's a trivial issue, but I am telling you that is not a trivial issue for people under stress who are having this problem who cannot get the database restored. For many people, where you have an ordinary sized database, maybe just a few megabytes, maybe a few tens of megabytes, and you do not know, if you do not know why it's a good idea to have the system tables, the system catalog in a separate file group, I would recommend that you don't do it at all. because the potential for problems in the future outweigh whatever problems it may avoid. There's another example I'd like to give. There are things called performance counters, which I would like to discuss in detail, the important ones, the ones I think are most diagnostic of problems. And there are performance counters, and those are associated with performance objects. You capture this data for a while, and then you look at it, and it tells you things about the health of your SQL Server. And if you're having problems, it can indicate things that you can do either in your Windows operating system configuration, in your SQL Server configuration, in your application design, in indexes. They give you good hints about where to look for that. One of the recommendations as a best practice is that a particular counter called the page life expectancy exceed 500 seconds. Now, while that may be a best practice, we'd all like that. Very often, people view that as a sufficient practice, that if we have achieved 500 seconds for the page life expectancy, that we're in good shape, and that is far from the case. I hope to show you that the shape of the page life expectancy graph is, in my opinion, at least as important, and very often way more important, than what the value that it has in seconds. You may have something in the tens of thousands of seconds of page life expectancy and still have a problem that the page life expectancy graph will show. And very often it will show you are having indexing problems due to the precipitous drop that the value may have, in spite of the fact that it remains well in excess of 500 seconds. My recommendation is going to be that when you see best practices, you try to get some idea of why this best practice exists. If you have no clue, I would suggest that you consider not doing it. If it is something that you understand, you very often might want to do a balancing and say, oh, in order to separate these things out, to do this in this manner, to rework my database, this is going to take a lot of effort. How much effort do you want to take to implement a best practice where you're not persuaded that it's going to have very good or very immediate consequences, when you have things right now that you know demand your attention that need to be addressed? And I would say very often you have specific things, best practices or not, that you know need to be done and that you need to be spending your time to do. And so I would suggest that best practices not be implemented mindlessly because they're best practices and therefore must have a very high priority in the list of things you do. So, best practices, I think they're good as a checklist to look and see whether you're doing them. If you're not doing them, to see why you're not doing them, to understand why they are best practices before you implement them. And also, weigh their value against other tasks you may have. You are probably a very busy person dealing with databases, and you need to prioritize your work. And just because something is written in an article that says some guru, even a Microsoft guru, says this is very important, doesn't mean that you should drop everything else in order to implement that.